Good evening. We have talked about the importance of the book of Genesis. When we began this study, I told you that we were studying the book of Genesis and we're going to go through. I wanted us to understand how the Bible is linked, how it's connected, how it begins in the book of Genesis, but throughout the entire Bible, the themes, the ideas are presented. And we see that. Genesis 1 and John 1, they are connected. You can't separate them. Genesis chapter 2, well, in Mark chapter 10 and in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus takes the principles of marriage and he applies them to the continuing creation, and he links Genesis chapter 2 to that. You look at Genesis chapter 3, you see the sin of man, and that's what the Bible's about. Restoring us after the fall of man. Genesis 6 through 9, Noah. Well, that's, Peter talks about Noah. Jesus talks about Noah. The book of Revelation, the judgment theme. Again, it all ties back to Genesis. Genesis chapter 12, again, you see the beginning of that promise. The Abrahamic promise and what it means for us. As we look at Genesis chapter 22, we are going to see one of the most important connections found in the Bible. Because in Genesis chapter 22, what we're going to find is the sacrifice of a son. And there are so many different things, so many different points that need to be made, that must be made, and that we don't have the time to make. But we're going to cover as much as we can in the time we have allotted this evening to look at the sacrifice of a son. I need to start off by understanding that there was a command. In Genesis chapter 22, starting in verse 1, we read, "Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham. And he said to him, 'Abraham,' and he said, 'Here I am.' Then he said, 'Take now your son, your only son Isaac.'" Understand the beauty of those words. Your only son. Picturing the idea of the only begotten Son of God. "Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." Can you imagine? God in chapter 21 tells Abraham, go ahead and let Ishmael be sent off. You don't have to worry about Ishmael. I'll take care of him. You do what Sarah says. So Isaac is truly his only son at this point. He has nothing to do with Ishmael anymore. Ishmael is not the one who will inherit. Ishmael will receive nothing from Abraham. And now that promised son, God tells him, here's the deal, go take him, sacrifice him. I will tell you where. And the reality is, as difficult as it is, when God commands us to do something, we have to obey. Acts chapter 4, verse 19, "But Peter and John answered and said to them, 'Whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you judge.'" Sarcasm. You know, I absolutely love reading bits and pieces of this in the Bible because you see different types of literature, you see different types of speech, and here's one where it is clear and evident sarcasm. Who's going to say that it's more important to listen to man than it is to God? In chapter 5 of Acts, they're going to give the answer to their statement here. In verse 29, "But Peter and the other apostles answered and said, 'We ought to obey God rather than man.'" Of course, Jesus tells us if we love him, we're going to keep his commandments in John 14:15. The very love that we have towards God is reflected in our obedience to him. If you do not love God, you will not keep his commandments. But the flip side of that is if you do not keep his commandments, do not say you love him. Because you're lying. The only way to show God our love is through obedience to him. Because that's what Jesus tells us to do. If you love me, keep my commandments. So how difficult do you think the position Abraham finds himself in? He has his only son. A son he has waited for. A son, he was 100 years old when he got this son. And now God, the God who he has followed, the God who he has put his faith and his trust in, the God who he left everything for, has told him, I want you to take that son. I'm going to show you where to go, and you're going to kill that son for me. That was the command. And when there is a command, there must be obedience. We might not like it. We might rebel against it for a time, but when God commands us to do something, there will be obedience. I'm reminded of Jesus telling us that every knee shall bow. Those who profess that there is no God, when Jesus comes again, their knee will bow. Because when there is a command, there will be obedience. Abraham was commanded, and there's going to be obedience on his part. In verse 3 of chapter 22, so Abraham rose early in the morning, and he saddled his donkey, and he took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose, and he went to the place which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes, and he saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. I want you to understand, that might seem dishonest, but I want you to understand that there is nothing dishonest about Abraham here. His faith is so strong that he genuinely believes that he is going to go worship God, he's going to sacrifice his son, and then he and his son will return. And you want to know how I know that? Because of the book of Hebrews. And we'll look at that verse in a little bit. Abraham believed that God would take care of the situation. He had full and utter trust in God. Verse 6 continues, so Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and the knife, and the 2 of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and he says, my father. You think it's hard making that trip? Now we realize Abraham's old enough to talk. We keep reading, and he said, here I am, my son. Then he said, look, the fire and the wood. But where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering. So the 2 of them went together. Understand, God did provide a lamb for the burnt offering. He provided a lamb for the ultimate sacrifice, and that lamb was Christ. But here we see, even now as they are going, and I want you to realize not only is Isaac old enough to talk, Isaac is old enough to look and to realize, hey, there's something missing. I want you to put yourself in the position of Abraham, and I want you to realize, how are you going to look at your son and know God told me to kill you? I have to be obedient to God. And yet your son is old enough to look at you and go, hey, where's the sacrifice? Look at the pain that Abraham had to be going through. But again, look at the idea of God and Abraham's very prophetic words that God will provide a lamb. Christ is seen throughout this account every step of the way. In verse 9, and they came to the place which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son, and he laid him upon the altar, upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand. He took the knife to slay his son. In this moment, Isaac is dead. As far as Abraham is concerned, Isaac is dead. We go to the book of Hebrews. In Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 7, we read, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He offered him. He didn't attempt to. He didn't try to. He offered him. In his mind, it was complete. It was done. When you look at the other things in which we told throughout the book of Hebrews, you look at the other examples of this, he left his country. These are things that are done, that are completed. The Hebrew author says that Abraham offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promise offered up his only begotten son, the Hebrew author taking it a step further, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding, now here's why, here's how he could do it. Concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. The Hebrew author says, even figuratively, he was dead, and Isaac received him back from the dead. But his actions, again, are foretelling, they're prophetic, they're looking at the future in which Christ would die. The lamb that God would offer would be slain, and then God would not figuratively raise him from the dead, but God would literally, he would powerfully raise Christ from the dead. Abraham went through that. Abraham was promised that through Isaac, through his seed, all the nations of the world would be blessed. And God said, I'm going to test him to see if he's willing to do what needs to be done for that to happen. And Abraham does it. But there's intervention. His knife, let's go back to Genesis 22. The wood is there. Isaac has now been forcefully put on the altar. Abraham has his hand out. He is ready to strike him. But the angel of the Lord, many suspect this is Christ himself. How beautiful of a parallel is that? Christ stopped Abraham from enduring the sacrifice that God would have to endure. And he saved Isaac from the death that he would have to endure. The angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, here I am. And understand that this is the exact same way God calls to him earlier. God says, Abraham, stop. And he said, do not lay your hand on him or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. How he says, you've not withheld him. It was done. In everything but that final thrust, Abraham had done it. In his heart, he had killed Isaac. I can't stress that enough. I want us to fully comprehend that Abraham, some people would say, oh, well, Abraham didn't do it. He was waiting for God to stop him. He was waiting for this. No. In his heart, in his mind, in every way that he could possibly do it, that hand was about to go down. Abraham did it. Then Abraham, verse 13, lifted up his eyes and he looked, and in there behind him was a ram caught in the thickets by its horns. So Abraham went and he took the ram and he offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. What can we learn from this? We've already made a lot of application. We've already seen the connections. And when I tell you that Genesis is a book that is seen throughout the Bible, I hope that you fully comprehend now just how many connections you can make. And there are connections I didn't make in the text. There are things that I could have gone and I could have pulled to. This is why we study these things. This is the purpose of our lessons on Sunday night, because you need to be able to take these, dig deeper and see how many other connections you can see, how far God has interwoven his word throughout the entire Bible. Because it's all connected like this. Every single bit of it. But what can we learn from this? Well, first and foremost, we learn that God expects obedience. We've already examined this. We've looked at verses like John 14:15. If you love me, keep my commandments. But I want you to realize how easy it would be for Abraham to look at what he's been asked and say, well, wait. At any part in his life, Abraham could have stopped and said, well, why do I need to leave? He could have stopped and said, well, I have Ishmael now. Why do I need to worry about having another son? Why not Ishmael? He could have stopped and said, why do I need to sacrifice? At any point, Abraham could have said, I will not obey. I will not leave. I will not send Ishmael away. I will not sacrifice Isaac. And if he had done it, he would not have been what we need. He would not have been the example. He would not have been the father of our faith. Abraham was obedient when it hurt him, when it cost him, and when it would have broken him. Don't think it didn't hurt him to tell Ishmael to leave. Don't think it wouldn't have cost him to leave the established home of his father. And don't think it didn't break him each step of the way as he walked up that mountain. God expects obedience, and Abraham shows us we must be obedient. His willingness to obey, even in such devastating loss, points us to the truth of how we must obey. But here's something else we need to understand. I have heard it said so many times. You know, I've had bosses who've said it. I've heard people talk about, this is how you need to live your life. People who say, I will not ask you to do more than I am willing to do myself. And people even say that about God. God's not going to ask you to do something he wouldn't be willing to do himself. I want you to realize that God did more than this. God did something he will not ask us to do. God did something that he would not allow Abraham to do. It's not a matter of doing what God would do. It's doing what God expects us to do, because God did more than he expects even of us. In John chapter 3, verse 16, a verse that parallels Genesis 22. We read, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." The Hebrew author tells us that Isaac sacrificed his only begotten son. The book of Genesis tells us that God calls him to sacrifice his only son. But God stops him. And God says there will be no sacrifice of humans. There will be no child sacrifices. But then God does something so much more than what he expects of us. He offered up his only son. Genesis 22 parallels the Gospels. The journey it took, the questions that were asked, the willingness to endure, and the actual deed. But the third consideration we need to take this evening is that God, when He issues a command, He provides the means for us to be obedient. At the end of our text, Abraham does indeed offer a sacrifice. He does worship God. He had reassured Isaac that God would provide. Now, he didn't know how. He didn't know what was going to happen. He didn't know. But he told Isaac he had such faith in God that God would provide, and that's what happens. God has a ram stuck in the thicket. Abraham takes that ram, he sacrifices it, and he offers it to God. In our command to be obedient to God, there will always be the means by which we can be obedient. It's as simple as that. God will never tell us, go do something, and then make it impossible for us to do it. It might be difficult. It might cost us. It might hurt us. It might break us. Abraham endured that. But God made it possible to be done. There are times in our lives where obedience to God will be difficult. And I don't know where you are in your lives. I don't know what you have going on in your lives. I don't know what is keeping you from being obedient to God in one aspect or another. But I do know that there are times in our lives where obedience to God is difficult. But it's never impossible. Even in the most unlikely of scenarios, there was a ram stuck in the thicket. Because God issued a command, and that command had to be obeyed. Go sacrifice to me. This evening, this is but a glimpse of the idea of what Genesis 22 offers us. And again, I encourage you, go home, read the text, study it, look and see how much deeper you can go. But this is why we study the Old Testament. This is why we study books like Genesis. This is what God has done for us, because you look at the accounts of Genesis and you go, wow, God told some guy to go kill his son. Then you look at the Gospels and you see God offered up his son for us. And there is no greater sacrifice than that. What a beautiful message it is. This evening, if you are here and you are not a child of God, then I encourage you, do what's necessary and do it now. Stop waiting. Stop putting off. I get it. There might be difficulty in your life that you just feel like you can't do it. It's possible. Abraham walked up a mountain with the intent to kill his son because God demanded it of him. We can endure. Be obedient to God. If you need to study, if you need to understand what's required of you, then we encourage you to come forward. Let us study. Let us look at how Christ died for you, the requirements of believing in that, believing in Jesus, believing in what he's done, the willingness to repent of the life you've lived, to make that confession that he is the Christ, the necessity of baptism, how we are buried into that death, how we come into contact with his blood, the sacrifice that was offered for us, so that our sins might be washed away. But perhaps you are a child of his, and somewhere along the way you've stumbled. You know, Abraham, he falls, or we've studied that. But it's hard to judge a man who makes a couple of mistakes when then he goes and turns around and shows faith like that. And that is why God calls him the father of the faith. Because of the faith that he had in this very instant. We will struggle. We will make mistakes. And if you are there, if you need the prayers of the congregation, let us help. Let us encourage you. Let us strengthen you. Let us do whatever is necessary. If you need the prayers of the congregation, if we can help you in any way, now's the time. As we stand and as we sing.
There's a stranger at the door. Let